How does the Pilot VP Fine compare to the Pilot Metropolitan Fine? Is the Metro a little finer? I want something a little less fine than the Metro, but not sure I want the medium. Okay, so this is a great point because now literally just coming off of a question asking about the difference in gold nibs between gold and steel. Is it worth the upgrade? You know, you got kind of the same situation here. Actually not that different than the question I just answered. Pilot Metropolitan, $15. Steel nib, relatively fine nibs. Even the medium is finer than most mediums, and the fine is definitely finer than most fines. So fine is going to be like an extra fine, or even finer than most extra fines from, say, European brands like Lamy, Kaweco, you know, those kind of things. Visconti, especially. Vanishing Point. It's a gold nib, 18 karat gold nib. It's a tiny little nib, so it doesn't have a ton of spring on it, but even still, Pilot grinds their nibs to be fairly similar, you know, from pen to pen, but the biggest difference you're going to have here is kind of that gold and steel. So in general, gold nibs, if they're a little bit springy, they could flow a little wetter, all else equal. Now granted, you've got two really kind of different pens going on here. The feed design is very different, the nib itself is very different, and maybe I'll zoom in here a little bit because I haven't been zooming a lot lately. This is one area where you can probably benefit quite a bit. So looking at, oh yes, that is not on autofocus, is it? Okay, well that is not going to do anything for you then. Okay, so sorry, forget that. Let me zoom back out. But anyway, so you can see even from this distance, the design of the nib and the feed is very different between these two. So there is going to be a bit of a different feel. You don't really need, I don't need to go into great detail about the difference of the design, but just know that it's a little bit different. So in general, if you check the Nib Nook on gouletpens.com, you can tell that there's a difference between the Vanishing Point and the Metropolitan. And in this case, the Metropolitan is actually slightly thinner than the line for the Vanishing Point. So if you're comparing fine to fine, the Metropolitan fine is going to be a little bit finer than the Vanishing Point fine. So from your question, you want something a little less fine than the Metro, but you're not sure you want the medium. So let's see here. Going up to the medium on the Vanishing Point is going to be a pretty big jump. So you not only have that the medium, or sorry, that the fine is going to be, let's see here. The fine, sorry, I got to read the question again. The Pilot VP fine compared to the Metropolitan, is the Metro a little finer? You want something less fine than the Metro. Not sure you want the medium. Okay, sorry. Yeah, the Metro is a little finer. Sorry, I have to like reference my notes pretty hard here because I wrote this late last night. Okay, so the extra fine and the fine Pilot nibs, yeah, they tend to be really fine. Mediums, okay, yeah, there is a big jump going from the fine to the medium. So if that's the case, then I think that you are going to probably going to regret if you go to a Vanishing Point medium in that case. And the broad really jumps up as well. So in general, a lot of people talk about like European versus fine, or sorry, European versus Japanese nibs, because there is a difference, honestly. The Japanese nibs, a lot of people tend to generalize and say that every Japanese pen, the nib size is like one size finer than European pen. That's not really true. It's usually the case I've found with extra fine and fine nibs, generally. So an extra fine European nib is like most Japanese fine nibs. Excuse me, and extra fine Japanese nibs are usually finer than anything that coming out of Europe. However, when you get to the mediums and the broads, I find that it tends to be a little bit more of a wash, with some exceptions. The medium Metropolitan is really kind of finer than most you know, European mediums, but that's kind of the exception. Most of the other Japanese mediums, especially when you get to the gold nibs, I find to be pretty much on par with European mediums, and you can check that out for yourself in the Nib Nook. Click around, look at some of the Japanese brands like Platinum and Pilot and Sailor, and you can see kind of how are the fine nibs looking, how are the medium nibs looking. You can see there's usually a jump, especially with Pilot, between the fine and the medium. So extra fine is usually on the extreme end, fine is usually pretty fine, medium, there's usually a big gap between fine and medium in terms of their nib width. And then broad is usually as wet, if not wetter, than most Europeans, for Pilot especially. So there's a very wide range between extra fine and broad with most Japanese companies. Whereas Europeans, it tends to be kind of compressed a little bit. So there's not as much of a difference between all those nib sizes. That's especially true with some of the steel nibs, like with Lamy, Twisby's that way a little bit. Even like some of the extra fine and fine, you're like, what's the difference really? Coeco's like that. It's like, kind of what's the difference between the extra fine and fine? You can't always tell. Lamy 2000 is a perfect example. You can really hardly tell the difference between extra fine and fine. It's not that way with most of the Pilot stuff. So back to your original question here. I think the fine is really going to be what you're looking for to kind of summarize everything. Hopefully somewhere in that answer I was able to get you to the right place. But the fine, don't go up to the medium. It's going to be too big of a jump. Stick with the fine.